It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Oakwood Hills. The sky was blue, the birds were singing, and the air smelled like fresh grass. In this little neighborhood, there lived a boy named Timmy Parker. Timmy was 12 years old, just a regular kid with messy brown hair and a big, happy smile. He wasn't super tall or super strong, but he was friendly and kind. Everyone liked Timmy well, almost everyone. Timmy had a best buddy, a little dog named Max. Max wasn't big or fancy. He was scruffy, with fluffy black and white fur that stuck out in funny directions. His ears flopped when he ran, and his tail wagged like it was powered by a motor. Max was Timmy's shadow. They went everywhere together. Max loved to bark. Oh boy, did he love it! His barks were loud and happy, like little bursts of joy. Woof! 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 He'd go, especially when he saw something exciting like a squirrel, a bird, or even just the wind blowing the leaves. The sound bounced off the houses and rolled down the streets of Oakwood Hills. Most people didn't mind Max's barking. They thought it was cute. When Timmy walked Max around the block, neighbors would peek out their windows or step onto their porches. "Hey, Timmy," they'd call, waving with big smiles. "Hi, Max," they'd add, chuckling as Max barked back like he was saying hello. Old Mr. Thompson, who lived 2 houses down, would even toss Max a treat sometimes. "Good dog," he'd say with a wink. Mrs. Lopez, the nice lady across the street, would laugh and say, "That pup's got a lot to say." Everyone loved Max well, almost everyone. But there was one person in Oakwood Hills who didn't like Max at all. Her name was Karen Jenkins, and she was trouble with a capital T. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Nope, she was the boss of the HOA, the Homeowners Association. That's a group of grown ups who make rules for the neighborhood, like what color your house can be or how tall your grass can grow. Karen took her job very seriously. She acted like she was the queen of Oakwood Hills, and everyone else was just there to follow her orders. She had short, spiky hair dyed bright blonde, and she always wore a frown that made her look like she'd just bitten into a sour lemon. Her voice was loud and sharp, like a whistle that hurt your ears. When Karen walked around, people got quiet. They didn't want to get on her bad side. Karen had a big problem with Max's barking. To her, it wasn't cute or funny, it was a crime. A big, noisy crime that ruined her perfect, peaceful day. Every time Max let out a woof, Karen's head would snap up like she'd heard a fire alarm. Her eyes would narrow, and her lips would press into a tight, angry line. She'd stomp out of her house, her arms crossed, and glare at Timmy and Max like they'd just robbed a bank. "That dog," she'd yell, pointing a bony finger at Max. "That dog is a menace. A troublemaker. He's breaking the rules." Timmy didn't get why she was so mad. Max wasn't hurting anyone. He was just being a dog. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, Max's barking was like a monster crashing through her quiet little kingdom. It all started a few weeks ago. Timmy was walking Max down the street, just like he did every day. The sun was shining, and Max was trotting along, sniffing flowers and wagging his tail. Then, out of nowhere, Max saw a fat gray squirrel dart across the road. "Woof! Woof!" Max barked, hopping up and down like he wanted to chase it. Timmy laughed and held the leash tight. "Easy, Max," he said, patting his head. But across the street, Karen's front door flew open with a bang. She marched out onto her porch, her face red and her hands on her hips. "What is that racket?" she shouted. Timmy froze. He looked over at her, and Max barked again, wagging his tail like he thought Karen was playing a game. "You!" Karen snapped, pointing at Timmy. "Control that mutt, or I'll make you sorry." Timmy didn't know what to say. He was just a kid, and Karen was a grown-up who looked like she could scare a bear away. "Sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, tugging Max's leash. "He's just excited." But Karen didn't care. She huffed and puffed, her cheeks puffing out like a balloon. "Excited," she said, her voice dripping with anger. "That noise is driving me crazy. Do you know who I am? I'm the HOA president. I make the rules around here, and I say that dog needs to stop barking." Timmy nodded quickly, pulling Max toward home. He didn't want trouble. But as they walked away, Karen kept yelling. "I'm watching you, kid. One more bark, and you'll regret it." From that day on, Karen was on a mission. Every time Max barked even just a little, she'd show up like a storm cloud. If Timmy and Max were in the backyard playing fetch, Karen would poke her head over the fence and shout, "Quiet down." If they were out front, she'd stomp over and wave her rulebook in the air. "The HOA says no loud pets," she'd say, even though Timmy's mom checked, and there was no rule like that. Karen just made stuff up because she didn't like Max. She'd glare at Timmy too, like he was the worst kid in the world. "You're too young to understand responsibility," she'd say with a sneer. "That dog is your fault." Timmy didn't like Karen. She was mean and loud, and she scared him a little. But he didn't let her stop him from loving Max. Max was his best friend, and a few barks weren't hurting anyone except maybe Karen's ears. Timmy's mom tried to help. She went to Karen's house one day with a plate of cookies. "Can we talk about this?" she asked nicely. "Max is just a puppy. He doesn't mean any harm." But Karen didn't want cookies or peace. She slammed the door in Mom's face and yelled through the window, "That dog is a problem, and I'll fix it myself." Timmy's mom came home shaking her head. "That lady is a piece of work," she said. Timmy didn't know what that meant, but he could tell it wasn't good. Most kids would have been mad or scared, but Timmy was different. He didn't yell back at Karen or cry about it. He just kept walking Max, kept playing with him, and kept smiling. Why? Because Timmy had a secret. It wasn't something he bragged about or told everyone. It was something quiet, something he held close, like a treasure in his pocket. Karen thought she was the smartest, toughest person in Oakwood Hills. She thought she could boss everyone around and win every fight. But she didn't know Timmy at all. She didn't know what he was hiding up his sleeve or who was helping him. And that secret? It was big. Bigger than Karen's loud voice, bigger than her HOA rulebook, bigger than anything she could imagine. See, Timmy wasn't just a regular kid with a dog. There was more to him than met the eye. Every time Karen yelled, every time she shook her fist or wrote a nasty note, Timmy didn't panic. He watched her. He listened. And he waited. He had a plan, not a mean plan, not a sneaky one, but a smart one. Something that would flip everything upside down and leave Karen with her jaw on the ground. What was it? Oh, you're gonna love this. It was so good, so perfect, that even Max seemed to know something was up. When Karen shouted, Max would tilt his head and wag his tail, like he was in on the secret too. The neighborhood didn't see it yet. The neighbors who waved at Timmy and Max, the ones who laughed at Max's barks, they didn't know what was coming either. They thought it was just a silly fight between a kid and a grumpy lady. But it wasn't. It was a story, a big, exciting story, and it was just getting started. Karen thought she was in charge, thought she could scare Timmy into giving up. She thought Max's barking was her biggest problem. But she was wrong. So wrong. Timmy's secret weapon wasn't loud like Max's barks. It was quiet, sneaky, and powerful like a superhero hiding in plain sight. What do you think Timmy's secret could be? Could it be something about Max? Something about Timmy's family? Or maybe something Karen did that she doesn't want anyone to know? I'm not telling you yet. You've gotta stick around to find out. This isn't just a story about a barking dog or a mean neighbor. It's a story about a kid who wouldn't back down, a dog who wouldn't stop barking, and a lady who thought she could win but didn't see the twist coming. So grab a snack, get comfy, and let's keep going. Because trust me, what happens next is gonna blow your mind. So, there was Timmy Parker, standing in his front yard with Max by his side. The sun was still shining bright over Oakwood Hills, making everything look golden and warm. Max's fur fluffed up in the breeze, and his little tongue hung out as he panted happily. Woof, he barked, chasing after a butterfly that fluttered by. Timmy giggled and tossed a stick for Max to fetch. It was a perfect day, well, almost perfect. Across the street, Karen Jenkins was watching. She stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her eyes like lasers locked on Timmy and Max. She didn't say anything yet, but Timmy could feel her staring. It was like having a grumpy cloud follow you around. But Timmy didn't let it ruin his fun. He had Max, and that was enough for now. Karen wasn't always so mean, at least, that's what Timmy's mom said. A long time ago, before Timmy was born, Karen used to be nice. She'd wave at people and even help plant flowers by the mailbox. But something changed. Maybe it was when she became the HOA boss. Maybe it was when she decided rules were more important than friends. Now, she was like a dragon guarding her castle, and Max's barking was the one thing she couldn't control. Timmy didn't know why she hated it so much. Maybe she didn't like dogs. Maybe she didn't like kids. Or maybe she just didn't like anything that made noise. Whatever it was, Karen had made up her mind, Max had to go. Every day was the same lately. Timmy would wake up, eat his cereal, and take Max outside. Max would bark at the birds or the mailman, and Karen would flip out. Sometimes she'd yell from her porch. Sometimes she'd march over and bang on their door. One time, she even wrote a letter and stuck it in their mailbox. It said, "Your dog is too loud. Stop him, or I'll call the police." Timmy's mom read it and rolled her eyes. "She's just being dramatic," Mom said, tossing the letter in the trash. But Timmy wasn't so sure. Karen didn't seem like the type to give up. She was stubborn, like a mule that wouldn't budge. Timmy's house was small but cozy. It had a red door, white walls, and a little porch where Max liked to nap. The backyard was Timmy's favorite spot. It had a big oak tree with a swing, a patch of grass for Max to roll in, and a wooden fence that kept them safe. Well, mostly safe. Karen lived right next door, and her house was fancy. It was twice as big as Timmy's, with perfect green grass and flowers that never wilted. She had a sign out front that said, "Jenkins Residence HOA President." It was like a warning to everyone, "Don't mess with me." But Timmy wasn't scared of her house or her sign. He had Max, and Max wasn't scared of anything. One morning, things got extra wild. Timmy was in the backyard tossing a ball for Max. Max ran after it, barking like crazy. Woof! Woof! His little legs zoomed across the grass, and his tail wagged so fast it was a blur. Timmy laughed and clapped his hands. "Good boy, Max," he cheered. But then, over the fence, Karen's head popped up. Her face was all scrunched up, like she'd just smelled something bad. "You again," she shouted. "That dog is ruining my morning. Can't you keep him quiet for 1 second?" Timmy stopped laughing. He picked up the ball and held it tight. "He's just playing," he said softly. Karen huffed. "Playing? That's no excuse. I'm trying to read my book, and all I hear is that yapping." Timmy didn't know what to do. He didn't want to fight with Karen, but he wasn't going to lock Max inside all day either. Max loved being outside. It was his favorite thing. So Timmy just shrugged and said, "Sorry, ma'am." Karen's eyes got big, like she couldn't believe he wasn't scared. "Sorry doesn't fix it," she snapped. "I'm warning you, kid. One more bark, and I'm calling the cops." Then she ducked back behind the fence, muttering to herself. Timmy looked at Max, who tilted his head and barked again, like he didn't care what Karen thought. Timmy smiled. "You're the best," he whispered, scratching Max's ears. That wasn't the end of it, though. Later that day, Timmy took Max for a walk around the block. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the sound of Max's paws tapping the sidewalk. Woof! Max barked at a pigeon that flew by. Timmy giggled and kept walking. But when they turned the corner, there was Karen. She was standing by her mailbox, holding her phone up like she was taking a video. "Aha," she said, pointing the phone at Max. "I've got proof now. That dog's a public nuisance." Timmy stopped. "What are you doing?" he asked. Karen smirked. "I'm recording every bark. When I show this to the police, they'll make you get rid of that mutt." Timmy felt his stomach twist. He didn't want anyone to take Max away. Max was his buddy, his pal, his family. But Karen looked so sure of herself, like she'd already won. "Please don't," Timmy said quietly. "He's not hurting anyone." Karen laughed a mean, sharp laugh. "Not hurting anyone? He's hurting my ears. And I'm in charge here, not you." She waved her phone in the air and marched back to her house. Timmy stood there, watching her go. Max sat down beside him and whimpered, like he knew something was wrong. "It's okay, boy," Timmy said, patting his head. "She's not gonna win." That's when Timmy decided he wasn't going to let Karen push him around. She could yell and record videos all she wanted, But Timmy had something she didn't expect. His secret. It wasn't a toy or a trick. It wasn't something he could hold in his hands. It was better than that. It was something or someone that made Timmy feel strong, even when Karen was being her meanest. Karen thought she was the smartest person in Oakwood Hills. She thought she could scare Timmy into doing whatever she said. But she didn't know the whole story. She didn't know who Timmy really was or what he had up his sleeve. See, Timmy's dad wasn't just any dad. He was a police officer. A real cop with a badge and a uniform and everything. Dad didn't talk about it much. He was a quiet guy who liked to keep things simple. He'd go to work in the evenings, driving his police car around town, making sure everyone was safe. When he came home, he'd hug Timmy and pet Max, and that was that. Most people in the neighborhood didn't even know what Dad did. He didn't brag or show off. But Timmy knew. And lately, Dad had been acting a little different. He'd come home and talk to Mom in whispers, saying stuff about trouble and someone breaking the rules. Timmy didn't hear everything, but he heard enough to make him wonder. One night, Timmy was supposed to be asleep, but he crept downstairs for a glass of water. He heard Dad's voice in the kitchen. "She's been causing problems," Dad said. "We've got complaints." Mom sighed. "Who is it this time?" Dad lowered his voice. "Karen Jenkins. She's up to something, and it's not good." Timmy peeked around the corner. Dad was holding a cup of coffee, his police hat on the table. "What's she doing?" Mom asked. Dad shook his head. "Can't say yet. But we're keeping an eye on her." Timmy tiptoed back to bed, his heart beating fast. Karen was in trouble? With the police? That was big news. And it made Timmy think. Maybe his secret weapon wasn't just Max. Maybe it was Dad too. The next day, Karen was back at it. She banged on Timmy's door, her face red and her voice loud. "Your dog barked at 7 a.m, she shouted when Mom answered. "That's it? I'm calling 911. Mom tried to calm her down. "Karen, it's just a dog. Let's talk about this." But Karen wouldn't listen. "No talking. I'm done with that beast." She stormed off, dialing her phone. Timmy watched from the window, Max by his side. "Woof." Max barked, like he was cheering Timmy up. And that's when Timmy smiled. Karen thought she was winning. She thought the police would come and take Max away. But she didn't know Dad was a cop. And she didn't know what Dad knew about her. Timmy's secret was growing bigger every day. It wasn't just that Dad was watching Karen. It was that Timmy was watching her too. Every time she yelled, every time she waved her phone or her rule book, Timmy paid attention. He saw how she acted, how she treated people. And he started to figure something out. Karen wasn't as perfect as she pretended to be. She was hiding something bad. Timmy didn't know what it was yet, but he had a feeling. A big, exciting feeling that made him grin whenever Karen shouted. Because very soon Karen was going to find out she'd picked the wrong kid to mess with. So what was Timmy's secret weapon? Was it just his dad? Was it something Max knew? Or was it a trick Timmy had been saving up? You're gonna have to wait and see. This story's just getting started, and it's about to get wild. Karen thought she was the queen of Oakwood Hills, but queens can fall. And when they do, it's a big, loud crash. Stick around, because Timmy and Max are about to turn everything upside down and Karen's not gonna know what hit her. Karen Jenkins wasn't just annoyed with Max's barking, she was obsessed. It was like Max had become her #1 enemy, and she was ready to fight him with everything she had. Every single time Max let out a woof, even if it was just a tiny, happy bark, Karen would lose her mind. She'd drop whatever she was doing, grab her phone, and storm out of her big fancy house next door. Her feet would stomp so hard on the ground that Timmy could hear her coming before he even saw her. She'd march right up to Timmy's yard, her blonde hair bouncing and her eyes squinting like she was staring into the sun. In her hand, she always held her phone up high, recording Max like she was a detective collecting clues for a big court case. "That mutt is a menace," she'd yell, her voice so loud and shrill it sounded like a whistle. The birds in the trees would flap away, scared off by her shouting. "He's ruining this neighborhood. I can't stand it anymore." She'd point her phone at Max, who'd just wag his tail and tilt his head, like he didn't understand why she was so mad. Sometimes, she'd turn the phone to Timmy too, like he was part of the crime. "I'm telling you right now," she'd say, her words sharp like little darts, "I'm calling the cops if this doesn't stop. You hear me? The police are gonna fix this." Her face would get all red, and she'd huff and puff like she'd just run a race. Timmy's mom tried to calm her down. She was a nice lady with soft brown hair and a quiet voice. One day, after Karen came yelling again, Mom stepped outside with a smile. "Karen," she said gently, "Max is just a playful pup. He's not trying to bother anyone. Can't we work this out?" She even held out a plate of chocolate chip cookies she'd baked, hoping Karen would chill out. But Karen didn't want cookies, and she didn't want to work anything out. She crossed her arms, shook her head hard, and snorted like Mom had said something silly. "A playful pup," she snapped. "That dog is a disaster. He barks all day, every day, and I'm sick of it. You can't sweet talk me out of this." Then she turned around and stomped back to her house, slamming her door so loud it made Max jump. Karen didn't just yell at Mom. She'd glare at Timmy too, her eyes like little storms. "You're just a kid," she'd mutter under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. "You don't know better. You don't know how to control that noisy beast." She'd say it with a sneaky smile, like she thought Timmy was too small and dumb to do anything about her. She'd wave her HOA rulebook in the air sometimes, a little red book with gold letters on it. "The rules say no loud pets," she'd shout, even though Timmy's mom looked it up later and told him there was no rule like that. Karen was making it up, just to sound important. She wanted everyone to think she was the boss, and Max was breaking her laws. But here's the thing, Timmy wasn't scared. Karen could yell and wave her phone and make all the mean faces she wanted, but it didn't shake him. He'd just stand there, holding Max's leash, and smile politely. "Sorry, ma'am," he'd say in his quiet voice, even though he wasn't really sorry. Then he'd pat Max on the head, and they'd walk back inside their little house with the red door. Max would flop onto the rug, wagging his tail, and Timmy would sit by the window, peeking out at Karen's house. She thought she was winning. She thought Timmy was giving up. But she was so wrong. Timmy wasn't fazed at all. He wasn't running away or hiding. He had a secret, and it made him feel strong inside. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't even guess, was that Timmy was watching her too. Oh yes, he was paying attention, closer than she ever imagined. Every time she stomped over, every time she waved her phone or shouted about the cops, Timmy noticed things. He saw how her hands shook a little when she got really mad. He heard how her voice cracked when she yelled too long. He watched how she'd look around, like she was checking if other neighbors were listening. Karen thought she was the only one keeping track of stuff, building her big case against Max. But Timmy was keeping track of her. And he didn't need a phone to do it, just his eyes and his brain. It wasn't just yelling, either. Karen started getting sneaky. One morning, Timmy found a note taped to their front door. It was written in big, messy letters with a black marker. "Your dog is too loud," it said. "Stop him or else." There was no name on it, but Timmy knew it was from Karen. Her handwriting was all spiky, just like her hair. Mom saw it and frowned. "She's getting worse," she said, crumpling the note into a ball. "Don't worry, Timmy. We'll figure this out." But Karen didn't stop with notes. A few days later, Timmy caught her sneaking around their backyard. She had a little camera, not her phone this time, but a real camera with a big lens. She was hiding behind the fence, pointing it at Max while he chewed on a stick. Woof! Max barked, and Karen clicked the button fast, like she'd just caught him stealing something. "What are you doing?" Timmy called out, stepping outside. Karen jumped like she'd been shocked, almost dropping her camera. "None of your business," she snapped, her face turning pink. "I'm gathering evidence. That dog's days are numbered." Then she ran off, her flip-flop slapping the ground. Timmy scratched his head. Evidence? For what? Max wasn't a criminal. He was just a dog who liked to bark at squirrels and play fetch. But Karen acted like he was the biggest problem in the world. She was obsessed, and it was getting weirder every day. The next time Karen came over, she brought a friend. Well, not really a friend, more like a helper. It was a skinny man with glasses and a clipboard, wearing a shirt that said HOA Inspector. Karen stood next to him, smirking like she'd just won a prize. "This is Mr. Peters," she said, her voice all proud. "He's here to check your yard. We've had complaints about noise." The man nodded and started writing stuff down, looking at Max like he was a wild animal. Timmy's mom came out, her arms crossed. "Who complained?" she asked. Karen puffed up her chest. "I did. And I'm the president, so it counts." Mom sighed. "Karen, this is silly. Max isn't breaking any rules." But Mr. Peters kept scribbling, and Karen kept smirking, like they were a team ready to take Max down. Timmy watched from the porch, Max sitting beside him. "Woof." Max barked at the inspector, and Karen's smirk got bigger. "See," she said. "He never stops. That's why the cops are coming next." Mr. Peters nodded again, like he agreed. Mom shook her head and went back inside, muttering, "This is ridiculous." But Timmy didn't move. He just smiled at Max and whispered, "Don't worry, buddy. She's not as smart as she thinks." Karen thought she had all the power with her phone, her camera, her notes, and her inspector. She thought she could scare Timmy and Max into giving up. But she didn't know Timmy was smiling for a reason. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. See, Timmy wasn't just sitting there taking it. Every time Karen did something mean, he got a little smarter. He started noticing stuff she didn't want him to see. Like how she'd twitch when someone walked by her house. Or how she'd hide her trash cans behind her garage, like she didn't want anyone to look inside. Timmy didn't know what it all meant yet, but he was putting the pieces together. Karen was loud and bossy, but she wasn't perfect. She had secrets too, maybe even bigger ones than Timmy's. And Timmy's secret? It was growing stronger every day she picked on him and Max. Karen kept saying she'd call the cops, but she hadn't done it yet. Maybe she was bluffing. Maybe she was waiting for more evidence. But Timmy didn't care. He knew something she didn't, something big. His dad was a cop, and Dad wasn't just sitting around. Timmy had heard him talking about Karen, about complaints, about trouble. Karen thought the police would be on her side, rushing over to grab Max and punish Timmy. But what if they weren't? What if they were already watching her instead? Timmy didn't tell Karen that. He didn't tell anyone. He just kept smiling, kept walking Max, kept letting her think she was in charge. The tension was building, like a balloon getting bigger and bigger. Karen was obsessed, stomping and shouting and recording every bark. She thought she was building a case to win. But Timmy was watching, waiting, and holding onto his secret like a shield. She'd glare at him, call him a kid who didn't know better, but he wasn't fazed. He'd pat Max, go inside, and let her yell. Because soon, very soon, Karen was going to find out she wasn't the only one with a plan. And when she did, oh boy, it was going to be a surprise she'd never forget. Days went by in Oakwood Hills, and things didn't calm down, they got crazier. Karen Jenkins wasn't just mad anymore, she was acting like a wild detective on a TV show. She didn't stop with yelling or waving her phone around. Nope, she got bolder every single day. One morning, Timmy stepped outside to grab the newspaper for his mom, and there it was, a nasty note stuck right on their doorstep. It was written in big, angry letters with a thick black marker. "Control your dog or else," it said, all in capital letters like Karen was screaming on paper. Timmy picked it up and stared at it. The words were messy and jagged, just like Karen's temper. He didn't know what "or else" meant exactly, but it didn't sound nice. He showed it to his mom, and she just shook her head. "She's really losing it," Mom said, tossing the note in the trash. But that wasn't the last one. The next day, there was another note. This one said, "Your mutt is too loud, stop him now." Timmy found it taped to their mailbox, flapping in the wind. The day after that, a third note showed up, stuck under a rock by the front steps. "I'm warning you, quiet that dog," it shouted in the same spiky handwriting. Timmy started collecting them, keeping them in a little pile on his dresser. He didn't know why Karen kept writing notes instead of just talking, but it made him wonder. Was she scared to face him? Or was she building some kind of secret plan? Either way, Timmy didn't let the notes scare him. He'd just shrug, pat Max on the head, and go about his day. Max didn't care about notes, he was too busy chasing butterflies and chewing sticks. But Karen didn't stop with paper. One afternoon, she took it up a notch. Timmy was out front, tossing a tennis ball for Max to fetch. The sun was warm, and Max was having the best time, barking happily every time he caught the ball. Woof! Woof! He'd yelp, his tail wagging like a little flag. Timmy laughed and clapped his hands. Good catch, Max, he cheered. Then, out of nowhere, Karen appeared. She didn't just stomp over this time, she planted herself right in the middle of their lawn, her hands on her hips and her face all scrunched up. She started shouting loud enough for the whole street to hear. This is ridiculous, she yelled, waving her arms like a crazy bird. That dog is breaking every neighborhood rule. I'm the HOA president, and I say he's got to stop. Max didn't know she was mad. To him, it was a game. Woof! Woof! He barked back, hopping around like Karen was playing with him. Timmy couldn't help but smile a little, Max was so goofy. But Karen didn't think it was funny. Her eyes got wide, and her cheeks turned redder than a tomato. See? See, she shouted, pointing at Max. He won't stop. He's a menace, and you're letting him ruin everything. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, wondering what all the noise was about. Old Mr. Thompson opened his door and frowned, and Mrs. Lopez across the street shook her head. But Timmy didn't argue. He didn't yell back or tell Karen she was wrong. He just picked up the ball, gave Max a quick pet, and said, "Come on, boy." Then they walked back inside, leaving Karen standing there, huffing and puffing. Timmy kept his cool every time. That was his way. Karen could shout and leave notes all she wanted, but he didn't let it get to him. He'd take Max for walks around the block, letting him sniff the grass and bark at squirrels. If Karen showed up, Timmy would just nod and keep going. "Sorry, ma'am," he'd say softly, even though he wasn't really sorry. Max would wag his tail, and they'd move on. Karen thought she was winning because Timmy didn't fight back. She thought he was scared or weak. But here's the thing, she didn't know Timmy at all. He wasn't alone in this mess, and he wasn't as helpless as she thought. See, Timmy had someone special on his side, his dad. Dad wasn't loud or bossy like Karen. He was a quiet guy, the kind who didn't say much but always knew what was going on. Dad was a cop, a real police officer who wore a blue uniform and drove a car with flashing lights. He worked late shifts, leaving the house when the sun went down and coming back when it was almost morning. Timmy loved Dad's stories about helping people, like the time he found a lost cat or stopped a car from speeding. But Dad didn't talk about work a lot. He'd come home, take off his hat, and relax with a cup of coffee. He didn't like drama, and he didn't like trouble. Keep it simple, he'd always say with a little smile. Lately, though, Dad had been acting different. Timmy noticed it. When he got home, he'd sit at the kitchen table with Mom, talking in low voices. Timmy wasn't supposed to hear, but sometimes he'd sneak downstairs for a snack and catch bits of what they said. One night, he tiptoed down in his pajamas, his bare feet quiet on the stairs. He peeked around the corner and saw Dad in his uniform, his badge shining under the kitchen light. "There's trouble in the neighborhood," Dad was saying, his voice serious. "We been getting calls." Mom leaned closer. "What kind of trouble?" she asked. Dad took a sip of his coffee and lowered his voice even more. "Someone's breaking the rules. Big rules. Not just little stuff, serious things." Mom's eyes got wide. "Who?" she whispered. Dad didn't answer right away. He just tapped his finger on the table and said, "We're looking into it." Timmy's heart started beating faster. He didn't know what big rules meant, but it sounded important. Serious things. In Oakwood Hills? He thought about Karen and all her yelling. Could it be her? He didn't have proof, but something told him Dad's words were connected to her. He crept back upstairs, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up tight. A little grin crept onto his face as he lay there in the dark. The pieces were falling into place, like a puzzle he was starting to figure out. Karen was getting bolder, leaving notes and shouting in the yard, but Dad was watching something too. And if Dad was a cop, and Karen was the trouble, then maybe, just maybe, things were about to get interesting. The next day, Karen was back with more tricks. Timmy was in the backyard, playing fetch with Max again. Woof! Max barked, chasing the ball across the grass. Then, over the fence, Karen's head popped up like a jack-in-the-box. She wasn't alone this time. She had her phone out, recording, and a big grin on her face. "Gotcha," she said, her voice all smug. "Every bark is more proof. The cops are gonna love this." Timmy stopped throwing the ball and looked at her. "Why are you so mad?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. Karen laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. "Mad? I'm not mad, I'm fixing a problem. That dog's a nuisance, and you're too little to understand." Timmy didn't say anything back. He just picked up the ball and walked inside with Max. But as he closed the door, he peeked out the window. Karen was still there, talking to herself and waving her phone around. She looked happy, like she thought she was winning. But Timmy wasn't worried. He sat on the couch, Max curled up beside him, and thought about what he'd heard Dad say. Someone's breaking the rules. Big rules. Karen kept saying she'd call the cops, but what if the cops were already onto her? What if Dad knew something she didn't? Timmy's grin got a little bigger. He scratched Max's ears and whispered, "She's in for a surprise, huh?" Days kept passing, and Karen kept pushing. One evening, she stood by her mailbox with a megaphone, a real one, like cheerleaders use. She turned it on and shouted, "Timmy Parker, control your dog. This neighborhood deserves peace." Her voice boomed so loud it made Max jump and bark back. Woof. Woof. Timmy ran to the window and saw neighbors stepping outside, looking confused. Mr. Thompson yelled, "Knock it off, Karen." But she ignored him, blasting her megaphone again. "I'm done asking nicely," she hollered. Timmy's mom came out and said, "Karen, that's enough." But Karen just smirked and went back inside. That night, Timmy heard Dad on the phone. He was in the living room, pacing with his police radio crackling. "Yeah, we've got more complaints," Dad said. "Same person. It's getting out of hand." Timmy sat on the stairs, listening hard. "Complaints? About who?" He didn't hear the whole thing, but when Dad hung up, he looked at Mom and said, "She's digging herself a hole." Mom nodded. "Good. She needs to stop." Timmy didn't know what it all meant, but he felt a little spark inside. Karen was getting bolder, but so was Dad's secret. And Timmy? He was right in the middle, watching it all. The pieces were falling into place, bit by bit. Karen thought she was the boss, leaving notes and shouting through megaphones. But Timmy wasn't alone, he had Dad, a cop who knew stuff Karen didn't. Every day she got louder, Timmy got smarter. He saw her tricks, heard her threats, and kept his cool. And that little grin on his face? It was there because he knew something big was coming. Karen didn't see it yet, but she would soon. Oh yes, she would. The big day finally came in Oakwood Hills, and it was wild like something out of a movie. Karen Jenkins had been getting madder and madder every day, but this was the moment she totally snapped. It started like any other afternoon. Timmy was in the backyard with Max, his scruffy little dog. The sun was shining, the grass was green, and Max was feeling extra happy. He chased a squirrel up to the fence and let out a big, goofy bark. Woof. It wasn't loud or mean, just Max being Max, all excited and silly. His tail wagged like crazy, and Timmy laughed from the porch. "Good boy," he called, clapping his hands. But that bark? Oh boy, it was the last straw for Karen. She was in her house next door, probably sitting by the window waiting for a chance to pounce. When she heard Max's woof, she lost it. Her front door flew open with a bang, and out she came, faster than Timmy had ever seen her move. Her spiky blonde hair bounced, and her face was redder than a fire truck. In her hand, she held her phone, and this time, she wasn't just recording. Nope, she was done messing around. She whipped that phone up to her ear, dialed 911, and started screeching so loud the whole street could hear her. "Help! There's a dangerous dog terrorizing the street," she yelled into the phone. "It's out of control. Send someone now, right now." Her voice was high and shaky, like she was scared for her life, even though Max was just sitting there, wagging his tail and looking confused. Timmy heard every word. He ran to the window inside his house, pressing his nose against the glass. Max trotted over and sat next to him, his fluffy head tilted like he was wondering what all the fuss was about. Woof. Max barked softly, and Timmy patted him. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, but his eyes stayed glued on Karen. She was pacing back and forth in her yard, still shouting into the phone. "Yes, it's an emergency," she said. "That kid's dog is a monster. Hurry." Then she hung up and stood there, crossing her arms with a big, smug smirk on her face. That smirk said it all. She thought she'd won. She thought the police were coming to grab Max and take him away forever. She thought Timmy was finally going to lose. Timmy didn't move from the window. He just watched, his heart beating a little faster. Max wagged his tail and licked Timmy's hand, like he didn't have a care in the world. Minutes ticked by, slow, quiet minutes that felt like forever. Then, all of a sudden, the sound hit. Sirens. Loud, wailing sirens cutting through the air. They started far away but got closer and closer, until everyone in Oakwood Hills could hear them. Timmy's eyes got wide. Max's ears perked up. Karen's smirk grew even bigger. She ran to the edge of her yard, waving her arms like she was guiding a plane to land. "Over here," she shouted. "The dog's over here." 2 police cars rolled up the street, their red and blue lights flashing bright in the daylight. The tires crunched on the pavement as they stopped right in front of Timmy's house. Neighbors started poking their heads out, Mr. Thompson from his porch, Mrs. Lopez from her window, even little Jimmy from down the block. Everyone wanted to see what was going on. Karen stood tall, her hands on her hips, looking prouder than ever. "Finally," she said, loud enough for Timmy to hear through the glass. "They're here to fix this mess." The car doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall guy with a mustache, someone Timmy didn't know. But the other one made Timmy's heart jump. It was Dad. Timmy's dad, in his blue police uniform, with his badge shining and his hat pulled down low. He looked calm, like always, his face all serious but not mad. Timmy's mouth fell open a little, and a tiny grin started to grow. Karen didn't notice who it was at first. She was too busy pointing at Max, who was still sitting by the window with Timmy. "There," she yelled. "That's the dangerous dog. Take it away." But Dad didn't even look at Max. He walked right past Karen, his boots thumping on the ground, and tipped his hat to her like he was just saying hello. "Afternoon, Karen," he said in his deep, quiet voice. Then he kept going, straight toward Timmy's house. The other officer followed him, and Karen's smirk started to shake. Her jaw dropped. Like, really dropped, so low it almost hit the grass. "Wait, what?" she sputtered, spinning around to stare at Dad. "What's going on? That's the dog's house. Why aren't you grabbing it?" Dad stopped at the porch and turned to look at her. His eyes were steady, and his voice was firm. "We're not here for the dog, Karen," he said. "We're here for you." The words hung in the air like a big thunderclap. Karen blinked fast, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Me," she squeaked. "What do you mean, me?" The other officer stepped up, holding a little notebook, and nodded. "We've got some questions for you, ma'am," he said. Timmy pushed the window open a crack so he could hear better. Max barked once, woof, and wagged his tail like he was cheering. Karen's face went from red to white in 2 seconds flat. "Questions," she said, her voice all shaky now. "This is crazy. I called you about that dog. He's the problem, not me." But Dad didn't budge. He crossed his arms and looked at her like he knew something she didn't. "We've been getting calls, Karen," he said. "Not about Max. About you. Turns out, you've been breaking some rules around here. Big ones." The other officer flipped open his notebook and started reading. "Dumping trash in neighbors' yards. Blaming them for HOA stuff. We've got proof, video proof." Karen's eyes got huge, like saucers. "Trash? Video? What are you talking about?" she yelled, but her voice wasn't so loud anymore. It was wobbly, like she was scared. Dad tilted his head toward Timmy's house. "Someone caught you on camera," he said. "Sneaking around at night, tossing garbage bags over fences. You thought you could frame people, make it look like they were the bad ones. But you got sloppy." The other officer pulled out his phone and held it up. On the screen was a blurry video, but you could see it clear enough: a lady with spiky blonde hair, dragging a trash bag and chucking it into Mr. Thompson's yard. It was Karen, No doubt about it. Timmy's grin turned into a full-on smile. He leaned closer to the window, his hands gripping the sill. Karen started waving her arms like a windmill. "That's not me," she shouted. "That's fake. You can't prove anything." But the officer shook his head. "We've got more than one video, ma'am," he said. "And witnesses. People saw you. They've been calling us for weeks." Karen took a step back, her flip-flop slipping on the grass. "Witnesses," she whispered. Dad nodded. "Yep. You've been so busy yelling about Max, you didn't notice anyone watching you back." Then Dad looked up at the window, right at Timmy. He didn't say anything, but his eyes twinkled a little, like he was proud. Timmy waved, and Max barked again, "Woof." Karen spun around and saw Timmy there, smiling big. "You," she hissed, pointing a shaky finger. "You did this." Dad stepped between her and the house. "He tipped us off," Dad said. "Timmy told me something was fishy. Said you were acting weird, sneaking around. So we started looking. And guess what? He was right." Karen's face twisted up like she'd just eaten a sour candy. "A kid," she said. "A kid got me in trouble." That's right, Timmy was the one who made it happen. All those days Karen yelled and left notes, Timmy had been watching. He didn't just sit there and take it, he paid attention. He saw her sneaking out one night when he was up late, looking out his bedroom window. She had a big black trash bag, and she tossed it over Mrs. Lopez's fence, then ran back home like nothing happened. Timmy didn't know why she did it at first, but he told Dad the next morning. "She's up to something," he'd said over breakfast. Dad listened, his coffee cup in hand. He'd said. "I'll check it out." And he did. He talked to the neighbors, checked their stories, and found out Karen had been doing it all over the place, dumping trash to make people look bad so she could find them with her HOA rules. Karen didn't know Timmy was so smart. She thought he was just a little kid with a noisy dog. But Timmy had been the key all along. He tipped off Dad, and Dad got the proof. Now, here they were, two police cars, a crowd of neighbors, and Karen in the middle, looking like she wanted to disappear. "This is a mistake," she yelled, but her voice was weak now. "I'm the HOA president. I don't break rules, I make them." The mustache officer shook his head. "Not anymore," he said. "We've got enough to take you in for questioning. Let's go." He pointed to the police car, and Karen's shoulders slumped. Timmy pushed the window all the way open and leaned out. "Bye, Karen," he called, waving with a big grin. Max barked again, "Woof. Woof." Like he was saying goodbye too. Karen glared at him, but she couldn't do anything. Dad tipped his hat to her one more time. "Next time," he said, "think twice before you mess with my kid." Then he walked over to the porch, climbed the steps, and ruffled Timmy's hair. "Good job, champ," he whispered. Timmy beamed. "Thanks, Dad." The neighbors started clapping, Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Lopez, even little Jimmy. "Way to go, Timmy," Mrs. Lopez shouted. Karen shuffled to the police car, her head down, her smirk long gone. The big reveal was over, and Timmy had won. Karen snapped, called the cops, and thought she'd get rid of Max. But instead, she got herself caught. And Timmy? He was the hero who made it all happen, with a little help from Dad and a big bark from Max. The big day finally came in Oakwood Hills, and it was wild like something out of a movie. Karen Jenkins had been getting madder and madder every day, but this was the moment she totally snapped. It started like any other afternoon. Timmy was in the backyard with Max, his scruffy little dog. The sun was shining bright, painting the grass a happy green, and Max was feeling extra bouncy. He spotted a fat little squirrel scampering up to the fence and let out a big, goofy bark, "Woof." It wasn't a mean bark or a loud, scary one. It was just Max being his silly self, all excited about the world. His tail wagged like a windshield wiper on high speed, and Timmy laughed from the porch where he was sitting. "Good boy, Max," he called out, clapping his hands to cheer him on. Max barked again, hopping around like he was dancing. But that bark? Oh boy, it was like lighting a match for Karen. She was in her big, fancy house next door, probably perched by her window like a hawk, waiting for any noise to set her off. When Max's woof hit her ears, she lost it completely. Her front door flew open with a loud bang that echoed across the yards. Out she stormed, faster than Timmy had ever seen her move. Her spiky blonde hair bounced with every step, and her face was redder than a ripe apple, maybe even a fire truck. In her hand, she clutched her phone like it was a weapon. This time, she wasn't just recording Max to yell about later. Nope, she was done playing games. She whipped that phone up to her ear, punched in 911, and started screeching so loud the whole street could hear her. "Help! There's a dangerous dog terrorizing the street," she yelled into the phone, her voice high and wild. "It's out of control. Send someone now, right now." She waved her free arm like she was flagging down a rescue helicopter, her eyes popping out of her head. Timmy heard every single word. He jumped up from the porch and ran inside to the living room window, pressing his nose against the cool glass. Max trotted over and plopped down next to him, his fluffy head tilted like he was wondering what all the shouting was about. "Woof!" Max barked softly, more curious than scared, and his tail kept wagging. Timmy patted his head. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, but his eyes stayed locked on Karen outside. She was pacing back and forth in her yard now, still shouting into the phone. "Yes, it's an emergency," she said, her voice shaking like she was about to cry. "That kid's dog is a monster. Hurry up." Then she hung up with a dramatic jab at the screen and stood there, crossing her arms tight. A big, smug smirk spread across her face. That smirk said it all. She thought she'd won. She thought the police were coming to snatch Max away and end her problems forever. She thought Timmy was finally going to lose everything. Timmy didn't budge from the window. He just watched, his heart thumping a little faster in his chest. Max wagged his tail harder and licked Timmy's hand, like he didn't have a single worry in the world. Minutes ticked by, slow, quiet minutes that felt like they stretched on and on. Timmy could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind him, each second loud in the stillness. Outside, Karen tapped her foot, her smirk growing bigger every time she glanced at Timmy's house. She was so sure of herself, so sure the cops would be on her side. Then, all of a sudden, the sound hit. Sirens. Loud, wailing sirens slicing through the quiet afternoon air. They started far away, a faint howl, but got closer and closer until they roared down the street. Timmy's eyes widened. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a little woof, like he was excited. Karen's smirk turned into a full grin. She ran to the edge of her yard, waving her arms like she was directing traffic. "Over here," she shouted. "The dog's over here." Two police cars rolled up the street, their red and blue lights flashing bright against the houses. The tires crunched on the pavement as they slowed down and stopped right in front of Timmy's little house with the red door. Neighbors started poking their heads out to see what was happening. Old Mr. Thompson shuffled onto his porch in his slippers, frowning like he was annoyed. Mrs. Lopez peeked out her window, her hands on the curtains. Even little Jimmy from down the block ran outside, bouncing on his toes to get a better look. Everyone wanted to know why the police were here. Karen stood tall, her hands planted on her hips, looking prouder than ever. "Finally," she said, loud enough for Timmy to hear through the glass. "They're here to fix this mess once and for all." She pointed at Max, who was still sitting by the window, his tongue hanging out like he was smiling. The car doors opened with a click, and two officers stepped out. The first was a tall guy with a bushy mustache, someone Timmy didn't recognize. He had a serious face and carried a little notebook in his hand. The second officer stepped out of the other car, and Timmy's heart did a big jump. It was Dad. Timmy's dad, wearing his crisp blue police uniform, his shiny badge catching the sunlight. His hat was pulled down low over his eyes, and he looked calm, like he always did. No rush, no fuss, just steady and quiet. Timmy's mouth fell open a little, and a tiny grin started to sneak onto his face. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Karen didn't notice who it was at first. She was too busy pointing at Max and shouting. "There," she yelled, jabbing her finger toward the window. "That's the dangerous dog. Take it away right now." But Dad didn't even glance at Max. He walked right past Karen, his boots thumping softly on the grass, and tipped his hat to her like he was just being polite. "Afternoon, Karen," he said in his deep, steady voice. Then he kept going, straight toward Timmy's front porch. The mustache officer followed behind him, flipping open his notebook like he was ready to write something down. Karen's smirk started to wobble. Her head snapped around, and she stared at Dad, her eyes getting bigger. "Wait, what?" she sputtered, her voice cracking. "What's going on? That's the dog's house. Why aren't you grabbing it?" Dad stopped at the porch steps and turned to face her. His eyes were calm but sharp, like he could see right through her. "We're not here for the dog, Karen," he said, slow and clear. "We're here for you." Those words hit like a thunderclap. Karen blinked fast, her mouth opening and closing like a fish flopping on the ground. "Me?" she squeaked, her voice so high it sounded like a whistle. "What do you mean, me?" The mustache officer stepped up beside Dad, nodding like he agreed. "We've got some questions for you, ma'am," he said, tapping his notebook with his pen. Timmy pushed the window open a tiny crack so he could hear every word. Max barked once, "Woof," and wagged his tail like he was cheering Dad on. Karen's face went from red to white faster than you could blink. "Questions," she said, her voice all shaky now. "This is crazy. I called you about that dog. He's the problem, not me." But Dad didn't move an inch. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her like he knew something big. "We've been getting calls, Karen," he said. "Not about Max. About you. Turns out, you've been breaking some rules around here. Big ones." The mustache officer flipped a page in his notebook and started reading out loud. "Dumping trash in neighbors' yards. Blaming them for HOA violations. We've got proof, video proof." Karen's eyes got huge, like two giant marbles. "Trash? Video? What are you talking about?" she yelled, but her voice wasn't strong anymore. It wobbled, like she was starting to get scared. Dad tilted his head toward Timmy's house. "Someone caught you on camera," he said. "Sneaking around at night, tossing garbage bags over fences. You thought you could frame people, make it look like they were the bad ones, so you could find them with your HOA rules. But you messed up." The mustache officer pulled out his phone and held it up for her to see. On the screen was a blurry video, but it was clear enough. A lady with spiky blonde hair, Karen, was dragging a big black trash bag and chucking it into Mr. Thompson's yard. Then she scurried back to her house, looking over her shoulder like she was afraid of getting caught. Karen started waving her arms like a windmill gone wild. "That's not me," she shouted, her voice cracking again. "That's fake. You can't prove anything." But the mustache officer shook his head. "We've got more than one video, ma'am," he said. "And witnesses. People saw you doing it. They've been calling us for weeks, tired of your tricks." Karen stumbled back a step, her flip-flops slipping on the grass. "Witnesses," she whispered, her hands dropping to her sides. Dad nodded. "Yep. You've been so busy yelling about Max, you didn't notice anyone watching you back. You got careless." Then Dad looked up at the window, right at Timmy. He didn't say anything out loud, but his eyes twinkled a little, like he was proud. Timmy waved with one hand, keeping the other on Max's head. Max barked again, "Woof. Woof." Like he was part of the team. Karen spun around and saw Timmy there, smiling big through the open window. "You," she hissed, pointing a shaky finger at him. "You did this." Dad stepped between her and the house, blocking her view. "He tipped us off," Dad said, his voice steady as a rock. "Timmy told me something was fishy. Said you were acting sneaky, hiding stuff. So we started looking. And guess what? He was right." Karen's face twisted up like she'd just bitten into a sour lemon. "A kid," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A kid got me in trouble." Dad nodded again. "That's right. He's smarter than you thought." Timmy's grin grew so big it hurt his cheeks. He leaned closer to the window, his hands gripping the sill tight. It was true, he was the one who made it all happen. All those days Karen yelled, left nasty notes, and shouted about Max, Timmy had been watching her. He didn't just sit there and take it, he paid attention. One night, when he couldn't sleep, he'd looked out his bedroom window and saw her sneaking around. She had a big black trash bag, and she tossed it over Mrs. Lopez's fence, then ran back home like a shadow. Timmy didn't know why she did it at first, but he told Dad the next morning over cereal. "She's up to something," Timmy had said, crunching his cornflakes. Dad listened, his coffee cup in hand, his eyebrows going up a little. He'd said. What did you see? Timmy told him everything, how Karen looked sneaky, how she kept checking around like she didn't want to get caught. Dad nodded slow. I'll check it out, he'd said, and that was that. But Dad didn't just check, he dug deep. He talked to the neighbors, asked questions, and found out Karen had been doing it all over the place. She'd dumped trash in Mr. Thompson's yard, Mrs. Lopez's yard, even little Jimmy's yard down the street. She wanted to blame them for breaking HOA rules so she could boss them around and charge fines. But Timmy saw her first, and he told Dad, and Dad got the proof. Now, here they were, 2 police cars parked out front, a crowd of neighbors watching, and Karen smack in the middle, looking like she wanted to shrink into the ground. This is a mistake, she yelled, but her voice was weak now, barely loud enough to hear. I'm the HOA president. I don't break rules, I make them. The mustache officer shook his head. Not anymore, he said. We've got enough to take you in for questioning. Let's go. He pointed to the police car, and Karen's shoulders slumped like all the air had gone out of her. She shuffled toward the car, her head hanging low, her big smirk long gone. Timmy pushed the window all the way open and leaned out. Bye, Karen, he called, waving with a giant grin. Max barked again, woof. Woof. Like he was saying goodbye too. Karen glared at him, her eyes narrow and mean, but she couldn't do anything. Dad tipped his hat to her one more time. Next time, he said, think twice before you mess with my kid. Then he walked over to the porch, climbed the steps, and ruffled Timmy's messy hair. Good job, champ, he whispered. Timmy beamed up at him. Thanks, Dad, he said, his chest puffing out a little. The neighbors started clapping, slow at first, then louder. Mr. Thompson clapped from his porch, his frown turning into a smile. Way to go, Timmy, he shouted. Mrs. Lopez leaned out her window. You're a hero, kid, she called. Little Jimmy jumped up and down, cheering like it was a parade. Timmy! Timmy, he yelled. Karen climbed into the police car, her flip-flops dragging, and the mustache officer shut the door behind her. The sirens chirped once, and the cars pulled away, taking Karen off to answer for her sneaky trash dumping tricks. Timmy hugged Max tight, burying his face in his fluffy fur. We did it, boy, he said. Max licked his cheek and barked woof. Like he was proud too. The big reveal was over, and Timmy had won. Karen snapped, called the cops, and thought she'd get rid of Max once and for all. But instead, she got herself caught in her own mess. And Timmy? He was the hero who made it all happen, with a little help from Dad and a big, goofy bark from Max. The street went quiet again, but it felt different now, better, happier. Karen's reign was done, and Timmy and Max were the champs of Oakwood Hills. The air in Oakwood Hills felt different now, like a big storm had passed and left everything fresh and clean. Karen Jenkins stood in front of the police car, her face turning as red as a pile of ripe tomatoes. The mustache officer held up his phone again, showing her the video one more time just to make sure she couldn't wiggle out of it. There she was on the screen, plain as day, sneaking around in the dark with a trash bag, tossing it over Mr. Thompson's fence like she was playing a sneaky game. Her spiky blonde hair bounced in the moonlight, and her flip-flops slapped the ground as she ran off. It wasn't blurry or fake, it was her, caught red-handed. This is outrageous, she sputtered, her voice all high and squeaky. She waved her hands in the air like she could make the video disappear. That's not me. You've got it all wrong. But no one was buying her story, not even a little bit. The mustache officer shook his head, his lips pressed tight like he'd heard enough excuses. We've got more videos, ma'am, he said, tapping his notebook. And people saw you. It's over. Karen's mouth flapped open and shut, like she wanted to argue more but didn't know what to say. Timmy's dad stood there, tall and calm in his blue uniform, his hat tipped back a little. He didn't yell or get mad, he didn't have to. His voice was steady and strong when he spoke. You've been breaking more rules than Max ever could, Karen, he said, looking right at her. Dumping trash, blaming neighbors, making trouble. That's not what an HOA president does. That's just wrong. Karen's eyes darted around, like she was looking for someone to help her. But the neighbors weren't on her side anymore. They were peeking out their windows, leaning on their porches, watching the whole thing unfold. Mr. Thompson stood by his door, his arms crossed, a little smile tugging at his lips. Mrs. Lopez had her curtains pulled wide open, giggling softly with her hand over her mouth. Little Jimmy from down the street bounced on his toes, whispering to his mom, "Karen's in trouble." They weren't scared of her now, they were laughing, whispering, pointing. For weeks, Karen had bossed everyone around, yelling about Max and waving her HOA rulebook like a queen with a crown. But that crown was falling off fast. The mustache officer put his phone away and pulled out a piece of paper. "Here's the deal," he said, holding it up so Karen could see. "You've got two choices. 1. You clean up your act, stop the trash dumping, stop the blaming, stop all this nonsense. Or 2, you face fines. Big ones. Ones you can't just dodge or talk your way out of." He handed her the paper, and Karen snatched it like it was hot. Her hands shook as she looked at it, her face getting redder and redder. "Fines," she squeaked. "You can't fine me. I'm the president." But Dad stepped closer, his boots crunching on the grass. "Not if you keep this up," he said. "The HOA doesn't protect people who break the law. You're done acting like you own this place." Karen's shoulders slumped, and she stared at the paper like it was a monster. She didn't have a comeback this time, no shouting, no pointing, no smirking. The fight was gone from her. Timmy watched it all from the porch now. He'd run outside with Max when Dad waved him over. Max sat beside him, his fluffy tail thumping the ground, his tongue hanging out like he was happy as could be. Timmy wrapped his arms around Max's neck and gave him a big, tight hug. "Good boy," he whispered into Max's furry ear. "You're the best." Max barked once, woof, and licked Timmy's cheek, like he was saying, "Thanks, buddy." The neighbors weren't quiet anymore. They started clapping, slow at first, then louder and louder until it sounded like a party. "Way to go, Timmy!" Mr. Thompson shouted from his porch, his deep voice booming across the street. Mrs. Lopez leaned out her window, her smile big and bright. "You showed her, kid," she called, clapping her hands fast. Little Jimmy ran into his yard, jumping up and down. "Timmy's the hero. Timmy's the hero," he cheered, his mom nodding behind him. Even the mailman, who just pulled up in his white truck, stopped to watch and gave Timmy a thumbs up. The whole neighborhood was cheering for the kid who'd outsmarted the HOA queen. Karen heard it all, and her face twisted up like she'd eaten something sour. She didn't say another word. She turned around, her flip-flops dragging on the ground, and slunk back to her big fancy house. Her head was down, her arms hanging limp, and that spiky hair didn't look so tough anymore. She climbed her steps, opened her door, and slipped inside without looking back. The door shut with a soft click, not a bang like usual. Karen was defeated. Her reign of terror, the yelling, the notes, the trash dumping was finally over. The police cars pulled away, their sirens off now, just quiet engines humming as they rolled down the street. Dad stayed behind, standing on the porch with Timmy and Max, watching it all settle down. Timmy looked up at Dad, his eyes shining. "Did we really win?" he asked, his voice soft but excited. Dad ruffled his hair and smiled a real smile, not just a little one. "Yep," he said. "You did good, champ. Real good." Timmy hugged Max again, burying his face in his fur. "We did it together," he said, and Max barked woof. Like he agreed. The neighbors kept cheering for a while, some even coming out to talk to Dad. Mr. Thompson shuffled over in his slippers. "I knew she was up to no good," he said, shaking Dad's hand. "Thanks for fixing it." Mrs. Lopez brought over a plate of cookies, chocolate chip, Timmy's favorite. "For the hero," she said with a wink, handing them to him. Timmy grinned and took one, breaking it in half to share with Max. The sun started dipping lower, turning the sky orange and pink. Oakwood Hills felt peaceful again, like it used to before Karen started all her fussing. Timmy sat on the porch steps with Max, munching his cookie and watching the street. Dad sat next to him, his police hat off now, resting on his knee. "Think she'll behave now?" Timmy asked, looking up. Dad chuckled a low, warm sound. "She'd better," he said. "We'll be watching." Timmy nodded, feeling big and strong inside. He'd stood up to Karen not with yelling or fighting, but with smarts. He'd watched her, told Dad, and helped catch her in her own sneaky trap. And now, she couldn't boss anyone around anymore. Inside Karen's house, the curtain stayed closed. No shouting, no stomping, no megaphone blasting through the windows. She was quiet maybe for the first time ever. The neighbors went back to their normal days, but they didn't forget. Every time they saw Timmy and Max walking by, they'd wave and smile. "Hey, Timmy," they'd call. "Hey, Max." Max would bark back woof. And wag his tail, happy as ever. The nasty notes stopped showing up. The trash stayed where it belonged in the cans, not in people's yards. Karen's big sign that said HOA President still stood out front, but it didn't mean much now. She'd lost her power, and everyone knew it. A few days later, Timmy's mom came home with a surprise. "Look what I found," she said, holding up a little blue ribbon. "It's from the neighborhood. They wanted you to have it." The ribbon had "Hero of Oakwood Hills" written on it in shiny gold letters. Timmy's eyes got wide. "For me?" he asked. Mom nodded. "For you and Max," she said, pinning it to his shirt. Max barked and jumped up, like he knew it was his too. Timmy laughed and hugged Mom, then Max, feeling like the luckiest kid around. "Thanks, Mom," he said. She smiled. "You earned it." The next time Timmy took Max for a walk, the street felt lighter. No Karen glaring from her porch, no phone recording every bark. Just sunshine, birds chirping, and Max trotting along, sniffing flowers. Woof. Max barked at a butterfly, and Timmy didn't shush him. He let him bark, loud and happy, because Max wasn't the trouble Karen was. And now, she couldn't say a thing about it. The neighbors waved as they passed. "Good dog, Max," Mr. Thompson called. "Smart kid, Timmy," Mrs. Lopez added. Timmy waved back, his ribbon bouncing on his shirt. Justice was served, plain and simple. Karen's face might have been red as tomatoes when she got caught, but she couldn't talk her way out of it. The videos, the witnesses, the proof, it was all too much. She had to clean up her act or pay up, and either way, she wasn't the boss anymore. Timmy's dad made sure of that, calm and steady like always. The neighborhood cheered for Timmy, the kid who'd outsmarted the HOA queen with a little help from his dad and his goofy, barking dog. Karen slunk back to her house, her big plans ruined, her reign over. And Timmy? He hugged Max tight, knowing they'd won not just for themselves, but for everyone in Oakwood Hills. And that's how it all went down in Oakwood Hills, a crazy, wild story about a barking dog and a clever kid who turned everything upside down. Timmy Parker, just 12 years old, and his scruffy little pup Max didn't look like heroes at first. They were just a boy and his dog, living in a small house with a red door, doing their thing. But they ended up bringing down the meanest neighbor around, Karen Jenkins, the HOA queen who thought she could boss everyone forever. It wasn't with fighting or yelling or anything loud. Nope, it was with smarts, patience, and a little help from Dad. And that's the coolest part of this tale. Sometimes, the smallest voices, like Timmy's quiet words or even Max's goofy woof, can make the biggest difference in the world. Think about it for a second. Karen was big and loud, stomping around with her phone and her rules, acting like she owned the whole neighborhood. She thought Timmy was just a kid too small, too weak to stop her. She thought Max was just a noisy mutt, something she could scare away with a few shouts and nasty notes. But she was wrong, so wrong. Timmy didn't need to be loud or tall or strong. He stayed smart, watching her every move, and he stayed cool, never letting her get under his skin. Max didn't stop barking, because that's who he was, a happy dog who loved his boy. Together, they showed Karen that you don't have to be the biggest or the loudest to win. You just have to be brave and clever, and keep doing what's right. That's a big lesson for all of us, isn't it? Sometimes, people try to push you around. Maybe it's a mean kid at school who teases you, or a bossy grown-up who thinks they're better than everyone. They might yell or point fingers or try to make you feel small. Karen did all that to Timmy and Max, didn't she? She shouted about neighborhood rules and waved her HOA book like a sword. But Timmy didn't give up. He didn't cry or run away. He kept his eyes open, told his dad what he saw, and waited for the right moment. And when that moment came, bam, Karen's own sneaky tricks came back to bite her. The truth always comes out, doesn't it? No matter how loud someone yells or how many lies they tell, the real story finds a way to shine through. Max helped too, in his own funny way. That little dog didn't know Karen was mad at him. He just kept barking woof, woof, chasing squirrels and wagging his tail. To him, it was all a game. But those barks were like a signal, a little noise that kept Timmy going. Every time Max barked, it reminded Timmy to stay strong. It annoyed Karen so much that she got sloppy, sneaking around with her trash bags, thinking no one would catch her. But someone did. Timmy did. And with Dad's help, they turned Max's barks into the sound of victory. So even the smallest voice, like a dog's happy yap, can change everything if you listen to it right. What's really awesome is how Timmy didn't do it alone. He had Max, of course, but he also had Dad, a quiet cop who didn't brag or show off. Dad didn't storm in like a superhero with a cape. He just did his job, calm and steady, listening to Timmy and checking the facts. That's a team, isn't it? A kid, a dog, and a dad, all working together without making a big fuss. It shows you don't need to fight by yourself. If someone's pushing you around, talk to the people who care about you, your family, your friends, maybe even your teacher. They can help you figure it out, just like Dad helped Timmy catch Karen in her own mess. And oh boy, that twist. Didn't it surprise you when the cops showed up and it was Timmy's dad stepping out of the car? Karen thought she'd called the police to get rid of Max, but instead, they came for her. Her jaw dropped, her face went white, and all her big plans fell apart like a house of cards. That's what happens when you think you're smarter than everyone else. You trip over your own feet. Karen's trash dumping trick was sneaky, but Timmy was sneakier in a good way. He watched, he waited, and he won. It's like a secret weapon. Being quiet and smart beats being loud and mean every time. So next time someone tries to push you around, remember Timmy and Max. Don't let them scare you or make you feel tiny. Stay smart, like Timmy did when he kept his eyes on Karen. Stay cool, like he did when she yelled and he just smiled. Watch what they do, think about what's right, and don't be afraid to tell someone you trust. The truth always comes out in the end. It's like the sun breaking through the clouds after a rainy day. You might feel small sometimes, but even the littlest voice can be loud enough to fix things. Timmy proved that, and Max barked it loud and proud. Oakwood Hills is a happier place now, thanks to them. The neighbors wave and smile when Timmy walks by with Max. No more nasty notes, no more shouting, no more trash in the yards. Karen's still there, hiding in her big house, but she's not the queen anymore. She learned her lesson the hard way. Don't mess with a kid and his dog when they've got truth on their side. And Timmy? He's got a little blue ribbon that says Hero of Oakwood Hills, pinned to his wall where he can see it every day. Max doesn't know what it means, but he wags his tail anyway, because he's happy just being with Timmy. This story sticks with you, doesn't it? It's not just about a barking dog or a mean neighbor getting caught. It's about standing up, even when you're small. It's about using your brain instead of your fists. It's about how the littlest things like a woof, or a kid's quiet plan can make the biggest waves. So what do you think of that twist? Pretty cool, right? When Karen called the cops and they turned on her instead, wow. It was like a surprise party she didn't want. Did it make you cheer for Timmy? Did it make you laugh when Karen's face went red as tomatoes? I bet it did. Tell me what you think down below. I want to know. Did you love how Timmy outsmarted her? Were you shocked when Dad showed up? And here's a fun question: who would you love to see get their comeuppance next? Maybe a bully at school? A grumpy teacher? A sneaky sibling who takes your snacks? Let's hear your ideas. Stories like this show us we can all be heroes, no matter how big or small we are. You don't need a cape or a fancy car, just a good heart and a little courage. Timmy had that, Max had that, and you've got it too. So keep being awesome, and maybe one day, you'll have a story just as cool to tell.